Welcome to the sightseeing tour of Old Norwich. In the Middle Ages, Norwich was a very, very important city. Very wealthy city. Probably the second most important city in the country, possibly even in Europe. This was because it was the centre of the cloth trade for approximately 350 years. It came about because the plague had decimated the population and the land fell into disuse because there was nobody to work it. So the land was put down to sheep. Sheep led to wool, wool led to cloth. A large number of men became very wealthy, building most of the magnificent buildings I'm going to show you. And in particular, they built churches. They thought if they built a church, they would buy themselves a place in heaven. Not only that, on All Hallows Day, once a year, the congregation prays for the souls that have gone to heaven. So they thought by building a church, they would keep their place in heaven. And this is why we have 30 medieval churches within 1 mile, more than any other city this side of the Alps. Most of these churches are made from the only local building material, flint. Under the streets of Norwich are miles of tunnels where the flints were dug out in layers of the chalk. There are so many miles of chalk tunnels in Norwich, the Victorians used to give tours of them. And in 1988, a bus fell into one of the old workings in Earlham Road, just in front of the Roman Catholic Cathedral. The first church on the left is St Stephen's. On the east end is a huge stained glass window. The bottom part dates back to medieval times. The window was removed and buried during the war for protection from bomb blasts, etc. This beautiful church, one of the 3 churches in Norwich where the great and good worshipped or are buried, has stained glass in almost every window and numerous brasses on the floors over vaults. On the left is the Assembly House, built by the Georgians as somewhere to meet, somewhere to socialise. At the back is a large ballroom with long chandeliers. On the right, behind the 10-foot high wall, is the Bethel Hospital, founded by Mary Chapman, who realised there was such a thing as mental illness, and she built this, the first mental hospital in the country, to look after them. On the left we have a Victorian park, Chapelfield Gardens. Still got the bandstand, but not used much today. Along the other side of the park is the Inner Ring Road, and 90% of the Inner Ring Road follows the route of the old city walls. In front of us is St John the Baptist Roman Catholic Cathedral. Started in 1882, finished in 1910, the last largest Gothic building built by the Victorians. The line of the flints that runs across the roundabout is following the line of the former city wall. And if you look on the other side, you can see there's a curve in it where there used to be a gate or a tower. The money for the building of this cathedral was started off by one of the richest Catholic family, the Howards, the Dukes of Norfolk, who own Arundel. They gave £200 in 1880, which equates to £100,000 today. On the left is St Giles Church. Approximately 1/3 of the medieval churches are still used for worship. St Giles is the highest church tower and has 8 very melodical bells. St Giles, Bethel Street and Willow Lane was the area where the doctors and medical professions lived. That's why there are so many rich Georgian buildings. On the left is St Giles House, the hotel featured in the TV programme Hell to Hotel. On the right we have the City Hall. Built as a job creation scheme in the 1920s and 1930s during the Depression. City Council was Labour controlled, so they built it to make work for some of the 2.5 million who were unemployed. It was designed by a Swedish architect in that style to promote as much work as possible for as many men as possible. St Peter Mancroft was rebuilt from an earlier church from 1350. The first thing they did was to enlarge the churchyard, as it was the time of the plague. In the bell tower are 13 bells, and in 1715 the first 500 changes was rung there, so there's even a bit of bell ringing history in Norwich. If you look to the right is the front view of the Bethel Hospital with the gable ends. The Guildhall was built between 1407 and 1413 by the Rich Cloth Merchants Guild, the Guild of St George. It has always been connected with the justice system. This hill is Jail Hill, so it must have been a jail. It's been a sheriff's court, a magistrate's court, an assizes court. On the lower end is a plaque saying Norwich Chief Constable, and even today is used very occasionally by the coroner. There's been a marketplace here for 800 years, but it's nothing like this one. It was a big open space in Victorian times. Gerald's, on the right, is the largest remaining family-owned department store in the country. There's 52 departments in that store. On the right, at the end of Gerald's store, is a blue plaque telling you that that's the site of a former corn exchange, and two famous musicians visited Norwich in Victorian times. The blue plaques are in this area, which is famous for its narrow lanes, streets and alleyways. On the left is the madder market. Madder was the red dye used to dye cloth, very similar to beetroot, a vegetable root, and there was a market to sell the dye here. On St Benedict Street are 5 churches in 300 yards. St Gregory's Church on the left has the largest, best preserved fresco in the country. It is 17 foot 6 tall and 10 foot wide. It was discovered by accident in 1861 when someone peeled some of the paint off the wall. St George and the Dragon was the guild of the rich merchants. On the right is St Lawrence's Church, standing unused today for the past 30 years. On the right again is St Margaret's Church, now an art gallery. On the right, almost next door, is St Swithin's Church, now the Norwich Art Centre. On the left, behind the trees and shops, is the Saxon Tower of St Benedict's Church. A £1,000 bomb went off here in 1942 and devastated a huge area. The church was totally destroyed, but by some amazing feat, the tower, dating back to the 10th century, survived the blast. In the middle distance is St Michael's Church, now a Discover Science Centre, with 35 experiments you can conduct with your children or grandchildren. This area is called Coslany, and this street, Westwick Street, and even Norwich are all of Viking origin. On the right, Strangers' Hall, formerly a rich merchant's house dating back as far as 1320. Now a museum opened on Wednesdays and Saturdays. It's a maze of stairs, alleys, corridors and rooms, and you could easily get lost in there. It's called Strangers' Hall because during the cloth era they brought in weavers from the Low Countries, and they couldn't speak a word of English and the locals couldn't understand them, so they called them strangers. On the right of the end of the telephone exchange is the fascia of a Tudor building. On the right again is St Andrew's Church, also known as Norwich Goldsmiths Church. How rich was Norwich to have a church as large as that for its goldsmiths? Next to that is Suckling's house. If you look on the plaque, you can see the dates of the great and good of Norwich who lived there between 1285 and 1564. At the top of the hill is St Michael's at Plea, now an SPCK book and coffee shop. St Andrew's Hall was a Dominican friary. It escaped being demolished by Henry VIII in the Reformation because it was given to the city of Norwich. It is the largest, best preserved friary in Europe, now a concert hall. We now cross the River Wensum, which winds its way all the way through Norwich, starting near Fakenham. But if you want to go by river to Great Yarmouth and the sea, you would allow a day. It is 50 miles by river, but only 22 miles by road. When the cloth trade died out, because of the Industrial Revolution and there was no coal anywhere near the city, Norwich became a major manufacturer of shoes, and the brick building on the left was the former Norwich shoe factory, which closed in the 60s. Straight in front of us is Henry Bacon's house. He was a very wealthy worsted merchant. He was Lord Mayor twice and Sheriff of Norwich during Kett's Rebellion in 1549. To the left is St George's medieval church. The nave and interior were rebuilt during Georgian times. Colgate is a Viking street name. However, most of the buildings in Colgate are Georgian. On the left is the Octagon Chapel. When built in 1746, was unique, being 8-sided and had the largest dome in the country. However, Wesley, the Methodist reformist, saw it and he copied it all over the country. On the right, the lovely Georgian house is now the headquarters of the Norfolk Broads. Down the passageway on the left is the old meeting house, built by the Quakers in 1694, the first non-conformist church built in Norwich. On the right is St Clement's Church, still used for worship occasionally. On the wall is a plaque telling you the Viking origin of the word gate or gater, meaning street. On the right is Norwich's most famous person, who is on the back of the English £5 note, Elizabeth Fry. She was born Elizabeth Gurney, the daughter of the wealthy Quaker banking family. She met a Mr. Fry, a Quaker from the West Country, and became world famous for prison reform. There's only ever been 12 people on the back of an English banknote. On the left, St Saviour's Church, now a youth club, painted inside purple and orange. A trust was set up in 1973 to look after all these churches by Norwich City Council. Straight ahead is St Edmund's Church. On the left of the door is a plaque saying Viking Norwich. This street is a Viking street, Fishergate. There's a Fishergate in York. Straight in front of us are the ruins of a Carmelite monastery where the monks wore white robes, still called White Friars today. In the churchyard on the left, you can see the ground is level with the tops of the walls. Hundreds of bodies were buried there during the plague. On the right is the closest view we can get of the medieval cathedral spire. Through the medieval arch on the right is the Bishop's Palace, where Queen Victoria once stayed when she visited Norwich. That's the third spire on that cathedral. On the wall on the right is a plaque which says that somewhere close to here Lord Sheffield was killed during Kett's rebellion in 1549. He was sent to put down the rebellion but was killed by the rebels. But that brought a swift end to the rebellion. They sent the army in. I'll tell you more about that as we go further round. Straight ahead is the Adam and Eve Inn, dating back to the 13th century. Built for the stonemasons and workers who built the cathedral, who were paid in bread and ale. Behind this flint wall on the left is the Great Hospital, the world's first old people's home, founded by the first Bishop of Norwich, Walter de Suffield, in 1249, still an old people's home today. On the left is St Helen's Church, which is still used for worship every Sunday. If you look at this plaque on the wall on the left, it said that this church was generously given to the city of Norwich by Henry VIII and his son Edward. But I ask you, was it such a generous gesture? Where did Henry VIII get all his churches from? The Catholic Church, so it wasn't his to give away in the first place. On the right is a beautiful Tudor house built in 1610. It has Tudor chimneys, thatched roof, spandrels, someone's initials on this end, leaded windows, flint walls, oak beams. Look at the windows. You can see some little figures painted in the glass. One is a peasant man and the other is a peasant woman. It was once owned by the cathedral and sold after an artist Davenport who lived there died. Bishop's Bridge, straight in front of us, dates back to 1295. When it was built, it was the only gate into the city. There were once 4 towers and an arch and gates, and they were removed for safety in 1800. There was a crossing of the river here as long ago as Roman times, being the narrowest and shallowest place all the way from Yarmouth. On this corner were 4 pubs. The Red Lion is still here. The building with the roses all over it was the Blackjack Inn. There was a green dragon beside the river and another on the opposite corner. In 1870 there were 780 pubs in Norwich. The reason for this, the water was unfit to drink, so everybody drank ale. There was even a small measure for children, and that's where the expression toddler originates from. This used to be a Roman road. Starts near Caister, near Yarmouth, where there's still the remains of a castle today, and went across the county. The Normans deliberately built the cathedral across it to block it, to send out a message: don't mess with us, look at what we can do. If you walk up the back entrance to the cathedral, Edith Cavell, the nurse, is buried at the back of the cathedral. She was shot by the Germans in World War I when she was working in a prisoner of war camp in Belgium as a spy. But the real reason they shot her is because she helped hundreds of English prisoners of war to escape. St Martin's Church on the right is now used by the probation service. Straight ahead is a tall 3-storey Georgian building, the former home of John Sell Cotman, one of the Norwich School of painters, artists. He's probably the most famous of them. There is a Cotman gallery in the Castle Museum where there is a collection of paintings by the Cotman family, mostly scenes of Norwich. The former yarn mill on the right is now a Grade 1 listed building. Below the tall windows on the right is a former monk's cell when it was part of the Carmelite monastery. St James's Church on the right was one of the first churches to be made redundant in the 1960s. As you can see, for the past 25 years, it's found a very novel use as a puppet theatre. On the left, behind the trees, are the ruins of a tower and a long length of city wall. This is Barrack Street. Upon the top of the hill is the former Britannia Barracks, HQ of the Royal Norfolk Regiment, now part of Norwich Prison. On the left, where these flats are, was the site of the former horse barracks for the cavalry. On the left is 400 acres of heathland called Mousehold Heath. It is here in 1549 where Robert Kett, a farmer, led a rebellion against the government over land reform. 20,000 rebels camped on this area. As we turn down this track, on the right hand side there is a mast of a former sailing wherry, a sailing barge used all over the Broads. The Cow Tower was built by the cathedral as an artillery tower in 1098. It has been used over the centuries as a prison, a toll house, a boom tower, and it must have been used for cows. The most likely reason for this is that there used to be meadows there, and perhaps they kept the cows shut up in the tower. There was a boatyard here where they built wherries. If you go to the Castle Museum and look in the Cotman Gallery, there is a painting of this, painted from the former Lord Raglan Public House, which shows two boats being constructed laying on their side with the Cow Tower in the background. Everything in this area is named after Robert Kett, the leader of the rebels. Kett's Hill, Kett's Tavern, and so on. On the right, on Riverside Road, is a medieval water gate into the cathedral. The stone the cathedral is clad with was brought by sea from Caen in Normandy in France, and was then offloaded onto barges and pulled by horses up a dyke or canal to the cathedral. If you look through the arch, you can see a ridge where the waterway once was. There was a ferry across the river here where the steps are, named Pull's Ferry, an age-old adulteration of the ferryman's real name, Paul. The flint part is now used by the Girl Guides. There is a painting of the front and the back of Pull's Ferry in the Cotman Gallery, done by John James Cotman and John Sell Cotman. At these traffic lights is the railway station. Round about 6 or 7 years ago, it was restored back to its original condition as it was built in 1848. They put back the railings, the lights, the pillows, as well as restoring the very elegant building. On the left, below this bridge, are the ruins of 2 towers called boom towers, where a chain went across the river to stop ships. As we turn left, look on the right. The longest, most complete, best preserved section of City Wall. There is a walkway along this complete length. On the left is Coleman's factory, where the mustard has been made. Jeremiah Coleman was a philanthropist. He built these houses for his workers and these 2 schools for his children, and elsewhere in Norwich he also built a hospital. On the left is a plaque where a bomb was dropped in 1940, killing 5 of Coleman's workers as they were going home at 5 o'clock at night. Further up Carrow Hill is the Black Tower, so called because during the plague, the Black Death, the men who collected and buried the bodies lived and worked from this tower. It was like an isolation hospital. On the right is one of 9 former gates to the city, Burr Street gates. On the right is the ruins of walls and towers, and on the pub is an artist's impression of how they used to look. On the right are 2 Georgian and 2 Tudor houses, and on the left is a medieval church now used by the Russian community. On the left is another former public house called the Jolly Butchers, which had an Italian landlady, affectionately known as Black Anna because she always wore black lace. She was a pianist, blues and jazz singer. She kept that pub until she was 76 years of age. She was a very charitable lady. The upstairs of the pub was a doss house where the down and outs were allowed to sleep. There is a photograph of her somewhere singing with George Melly, who recently died. Norwich has a saint, Dame Julian of Norwich. She was a nun who bricked herself into a cell, called an anchoress in an anchorite. She was a mystic, gave advice to and help to people. She was ill. She had this vision of God. She then wrote a book about it called Revelations of Divine Love. The first book written in English, first book written by a woman. You can still buy a copy of it today. The shrine, chapel and convent is not the original building. It was destroyed by a bomb in 1942 and was rebuilt and rededicated in 1953. Certainly didn't do her any harm. She lived to the ripe old age of 88, spectacular age in the 15th century. Now we come down onto King Street, the longest and oldest street in Norwich, and in its time was probably the most notorious. It had 2 breweries, 100 pubs, dockers, ships, sailors and everything else that went with it. On the right is a medieval trading hall built by Robert Topps, a very wealthy merchant. In his will, it decreed that it had to be sold. and you can see it was split up into 6 parts. When it was restored about 25 years ago, it was realised that the upstairs was one big room. When they removed the partition walls, they discovered in the rafters a wooden carved dragon, and that is why it's named Dragon Hall. It is now a museum open 6 days of the week, not Saturdays. On the left is the Music House. It's the oldest dwelling house in Norwich, built in 1170 by a Jewish family named Jernet. Opposite is one of the 100 pubs that were in King Street. And next door is one of the former breweries, Young's Crochet and Young's, which closed in the mid-60s. On the right is a medieval church now used by 7 artists for studios. The pub on the right, Le Rouen, subsided when the large underground castle shopping mall was built. It had to be rebuilt. It's a listed building. The church on the right is open every day of the year for worship. The next church on the right, All Saints Church, is now an internet cafe run by a charity. Very cheap cup of tea in there, 30p a cup. The thatched building on the right, which is one of only 5 left after the fires of 1507 and 1509, has been a bank, a greengrocer's, a pub. It's now a hair studio and restaurant. The Norman castle started life as a wooden motte and bailey. The stone the castle is built from, like the cathedral, was brought from Caen in Normandy by sea. It was built as a royal palace, but spent the next 500 years as a prison. For the past 100 years, it's been used as a museum. It's not the original condition of the castle. The Victorians refaced it with Bath stone between 1884 and 1894. Robert Kett, the yeoman farmer who led a rebellion against the government over land reform, was captured when his rebellion was crushed, and he was put on trial in London, and he was brought back here, where he was hung, drawn and quartered from the battlements of that castle, and his remains hung on there for many years. His widow tried to get them taken down, but they wanted them left as a deterrent. The building on the left is the former home of Amelia Opie, a famous author and writer. The impressive building on the left is the former Gurneys Bank. The Gurneys, who were Quakers, were very wealthy and successful bankers. Elizabeth Fry was their daughter. Gurneys merged with a local family named Barclays to found Barclays Bank. On the right is the Agricultural Hall, and the statue is the Angel of Peace. If you look, she's putting her sword away. It's a war memorial to the First World and the Boer War. Anglia Television have now got the old Agricultural Hall. They took it over when the cattle market closed in 1965. On the right is the Ethelbert Gate to the cathedral. The citizens of Norwich rioted in 1274 and they burnt this gate down. They also burnt half the cathedral down, so they were made to rebuild it. But if you look at the little black plaque on the right hand side at the bottom of the gate, they took 3 centuries to do it. The Saxon marketplace we are looking at is called Tomeland, but the name Tomeland is Viking and means open space. On the right is the Erpingham Gate to the cathedral. Thomas Erpingham was the leader of the archers at the Battle of Agincourt, where the English scored a spectacular victory over the French. They killed 20,000 French. They only lost 150 soldiers. and they were outnumbered 10 to 1. So they built this gate as a thanksgiving to God when they got back after the battle. But what was the real reason why the English scored a spectacular victory over the French? It was, of course, the longbow. They could fire 6 or 7 off in the same time it took to fire one with a crossbow. The building on the left is the former home of Augustine Stewart. I believe he was sheriff during Kett's Rebellion. One of those 2 green plaques on the front tells you that he loaned his house to the army during Kett's Rebellion. The building that's covered in scaffolding is the former Samson and Hercules Ballroom. During the war, there was 40 American air bases in Norfolk, and a lot of local girls met their GI husbands here. The Maid's Head Hotel is reputedly the oldest hotel in England. Queen Elizabeth I stayed there when she visited Norwich in 1568. On the right is Princes Street. And if you look on the right again, is St George's Church. Like the other St George's Church in Norwich, it was rebuilt in Georgian times, but this time with a brick nave, not a stone one. It's a very beautiful church inside. John Crone, the artist, worshipped in that church. Don't ask me why the clock isn't working, everyone asked me that question. On the right is St Peter Hungate Church, which has stood empty for the last 10 or 15 years, but in the last few weeks it's been used by an art college. On the left, in another church, is an organ built by a world-famous Hollywood organ builder. Every first Thursday in every month they have an organ recital in there at lunchtime. And on the right is Elm Hill, Norwich's version of the Shambles. There was a fire here in 1507, burnt this street right to the ground, but the Britain's Arms, the thatched building on the right, escaped the blaze. It wasn't a pub then, it was what they called a beguine, which was a religious women's sanctuary. On the left is the Blackfriars Hall, and immediately after that, down the stairs on the left, is a medieval crypt. If you look on the menu board, you'll probably see a drawing of what it looks like. And as we swing round to the right, you will see our beautiful Tudor street. There's a great resemblance between this and the Shambles, which is in York. They're both very similar, except the Shambles is a lot narrower. Both got similar sorts of shops, specialised. There's one big difference between the Shambles and Elm Hill. That's just, there's nobody in Elm Hill, whereas the Shambles you would be heaving shoulder to shoulder with people. In the 1920s, Norwich City Council were going to pull this street down, but they reckoned without the Norwich Society, who mounted a campaign, and eventually it came to a vote, and it was carried by one vote, the mayor's casting vote, to restore this street. So we're very, very lucky that the Norwich Society mounted a campaign to save this street. On the right hand side is a former church. If you look at the tower, half of it is missing. It fell down in 1910, so they thought they'd better restore the rest of the church, which had stood empty for 100 years, before that fell down. But if you look at the way they carried out the work, it could only be described as a bodge. We're now on to Bridge Street and heading out of Norwich. There used to be a ducking stool on this bridge on the right, and the pub on the left, the Mischief Tavern, dates back to 1600. This is the end of the tour. Thank you very much for coming on board. I'll give you a choice now. I can take you back to the place where you started from, or I can drop you off somewhere along the route, such as the cathedral or the castle, or take you back to the marketplace, or anywhere else along the route where you might like to stop for a longer, closer look at something. Thank you very much for coming on the tour.